leave. And hello, my name is Hackle. I'm based in New Zealand. I work at Xero. Xero is everywhere, but I work in the New Zealand Xero. And well, you guessed it. I was born in the year of the monkey. It's the monkey face. Welcome to Dude, Where's My Class? AKA Culture Shock, front end. And speaking of which, when I first came to New Zealand, I was kindly given this book called Culture Shock New Zealand, and it was hilarious. Now, one of my favorites from the book, it's how there are always some Kiwis or New Zealanders, that's how we call ourselves, Kiwis, who would walk in bare feet anywhere, anytime. I mean, it could be a gravelly road in biting cold winter. Of course, by biting cold, I mean like 10 degrees Celsius. You're going to hate me. And there, you will see some Kiwis walking in bare feet. And naturally, there would be small rocks or pointed objects lying around somewhere. And a true Kiwi, as they say, should feel no such pain when they stepped on one of these things. And when you do see somebody all of a sudden grabbing their feet and crying out loud in tears, you would know these are the people like me who are just trying to fit in, despite the nonchalant comment from the Kiwis. New, he's new. You know where I'm going with this. Front end, back end. So you would ask, hey, what makes you qualified to speak on this topic? I would like to think it's because I've kind of been burning it at both ends. I've been shifting focus between front end and back end and front end over the last 80 years. I mean, the last few years. I'm a bit nervous. Well, these frameworks and languages kind of sum up my transition from one side to the other. You notice how I list languages for front end, for languages for back end, and frameworks for front end. That's just industry standard, in case you haven't got the memo, okay? Also, it's important to clarify, React people insist React is not a framework, it's just a library. Now, I thought you should know, because of my experience from both ends, it puts me in a very enviable position in that I can make jokes about both front-end and back-end developers. So here we go. Are you comfortable up there, front-end developers? And this one, poor lion. What do you think is a man in a lion suit? I mean, that's not much better, is it? I'm sorry to have given you that thought. Here, it's a very artistic rendition of front end. And this rendition of back end is a bit too objective, I'm afraid. What's the typical backend attitude towards front end? Well, it used to be something like this. Why can't you be normal? Or this, a bit of sarcasm. Mind you, not all backend developers these days know how to join tables, okay? Because we build microservices. I'm sorry about the sarcasm tone. I just can't help it. The mental burden of being a developer for so many years, it's tough. And more sarcasm. And more gnarly comments. Now, honestly, I still think at some point of time, maybe in the distant past, some of these statements might have been plausible, maybe minus the attitude. But not anymore. Not cool to say these things these days. Times have changed. Front end have revolutionized itself so many times. And I feel we need to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes every week. Some of the things they do are actually kind of cool for front end. And that is what I want to share with you today. Of course, the front end developers wouldn't want me to tell you they're cool, right? They know they're cool and possibly act on that assumption. That's a joke. I told you I could make jokes about both ends. Let's not get offended. So the content of this talk, we'll look at a few shocking and usual suspects of front end. Quite a few anecdotes, misconceptions, party tricks even. There'll be a few moments of disbelief, surprise, epiphany, or just good fun. I'll share a few code examples, quick demos, some rationalization, if you don't mind. Disclaimer, very important. There'll be a lot of opinions, a few facts. Everything will be limited by my personal experience. This is not an overview, and you should be fairly warned. This is not a completely ranting session. Credit may be given when not due, or vice versa. And this is not to be taken seriously, like everything front end. That's a joke. No, I mean, I don't mean front end as a joke. I mean, that was a joke, okay? Phew. So before I got started to write code for front end in anger, some smartass in the team created this survey to see how confident we felt about certain technologies. As a mostly back-endy developer, these were my answers. Mostly 9 out of 10, of course. Pretty confident. Brave new world. Or do you sense a bit of a disaster for me already? By the way, you should totally do this survey for your team. I guarantee you will love the results. Well, let's see how I fared over the years. Without further ado, let's get the journey underway. We'll start with this easy target, HTML. So, on my first days, I was given the task of writing a HTML file from scratch. A bit insulting, right? To an experienced developer. I seriously thought we must have automated such tedious tasks. Dreamweaver, anyone? Then I realized, even in this age of modernization, it's still needed sometimes to manually write out a HTML doc. Never mind, no problem, boss. Give me 5 minutes and I shall just happily div away. You notice I said div away. Anecdotally, with a New Zealand accent, we call developers with endearment divs. Hello, divs. I love it. Okay, 5 minutes later, including a bit of watercolor talk, this is what I turned in. And my colleagues were like, with a smirk on their faces, guess it, backend div. Turns out it's not good practice to call everything a div. Div would be the tag of last resort. Professional HTML writers, they're meticulous with what tag to choose. Each tag should clearly express what the content will be. Therefore, human beings as well as search engines will have no problem understanding what exactly the tags are about. Now, there is this movement called semantic HTML. Tag it as you mean it. Only if you do this, we can get good SEO results, good accessibility, expressive code, readable code for developers. We still need a div, but remember to div in small places only and div in moderation. So that was good. I was sold. And so should you be. However, I was silly enough to start looking at page sources of famous websites, and I tell you what, I don't really like what I found. Mind you, this is not just any website. It's quite a famous website for front-end development these days. I mean, come on, people. And you see, front-end, it's complicated. Let's keep that in mind. But don't despair. The header, nav, section, main, article, aside, and footer, they're sweet and really helpful. So next time you find yourself diving away, think about semantic HTML. Let's quickly move on to a slightly more interesting topic. Something we all love, don't we? And I'm quite sure we're all quite confident about our CSS skills. I was. But once I started working on CSS, it's always a bit like this. Ooh, I could watch that all day. It's a bit long. So I was assigned this Oxfordy task one day to style the list above as parsley, comma, sage, comma, rosemary, comma, and thyme as below. This is a good example in semantic HTML. We have a UL tag, but it's good for semantics. But the formatted text with Oxford commas is better for reading. See, CSS is not just for looks. How do you feel about this tiny task? I must say I felt pretty good. So I rolled up my sleeves and stacked up a few sugary drinks and there we go. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. This list is not formatted. Now, what do I do? Well, first of all, I need to make this whole thing one line. So this is what I would do. Still got my CSS skills. Beautiful. Now, surely to add commas, I need to show off my JavaScript skills. 9 out of 10, remember? So, easy as. I'll give you a few seconds to read over that, no problem. And voila, look here. I can safely claim 8 story points. However, that was not liked by my front-end divs. How else would I do it? They said they want it done without any JavaScript because, you know, everybody hates JavaScript. So my beautiful JavaScript code is no good. And what I eventually did, with the help of my div friends, I can uncomment properly, is this. I'll give you a few seconds to read, but this basically says for every list item except the last one, append a comma at the end. And for the very last list item, put end in front. Look here. There, I can claim my points. There you go. Magic. Couldn't write JavaScript. Anecdotally, if you remember that, I'll show you again. That's a lot of code, right? There's a similar selector. If you look at this, if you can see my cursor, can you guess what front-end people call it? The owl selector. See, front-end is cute. Okay? Okay, another day I was asked to do this task, make this crazy looking loading animation. Being a very experienced developer, I knew at that moment is my chance to show off my amazing animation editing skills, right? So I asked my boss, hey, can I get a license to this animation software, please? And they looked at me and went, you guessed it, backend. Now, the answer to this deasing animation task is, of course, CSS again. Just so you believe me, this is the code. Now, look at HTML. You'll have to forgive me for my arbitrary choice of text that kind of contradicts my previous slides a little. Look, there's no JavaScript. Well done, Hackle. Currently, it's not very exciting. That's because it's front end. Now, that's a joke. It's because I disabled the animation, of course. Now, if I do this to enable the animation, we'll see what will happen. Whoa, we see bubbles growing and shrinking. And if I uncomment this piece of code, the bubbles would have a delay in their animation. How's that? I'm so proud. Now, of course, that's all fancy. The real trick is in this keyframe thing. You see, it declares a few key points that are relative to the duration of the animation. Each would represent a certain point in time, and each key point would have its own styles, and the browser would take all these things and create animations for us. Declarative, I love it. So next time you want to build some simple animations, think about CSS. I would be remiss not to mention there are people who took CSS to the extreme and really show off what you can do with pure CSS. For example, you want to check out this portrait by Diana Adrian. It's better to look at in the browser. Look, it's all divs, all CSS. Could you believe it? It's madness. What you can do with CSS. So the moral of the story, next time you need a portrait done, think about CSS. Just takes a few years, I guess. What I've learned, CSS can be ugly and unpredictable because of the many-to-many relationships between rules and elements. There's no easy way to find out exactly what styles are applied to an element before runtime. By runtime, I mean with the help of dev tools, as in browsers. Scaling CSS is a massive challenge. However, there are solutions revolving around scoping, naming conventions, and something strange called CSS in JavaScript. Yuck. Since we mentioned JavaScript, let's move very quickly to the dreaded topic of JavaScript, one that makes a lot of us, also including me, shudder a little in cold sweat. And if you're one of these unlucky people like me, you run into something like this one day. Now, within a top-level function, not a method within the class, mind you, people write this .name. As a C# programmer, this confused the hell out of me. Surely this is bad code. And let's see it in action, actually. This is our code. Sure enough, this won't work, right? And let's give it a spin. See, undefined. Doesn't work. And I thought, this must be useless. However, then I learned the proper way to use this function is to bind an object to it. And this object will then become this. So let's create a class. Oh, familiar. A person with a name field. We create a person and pass it to this bind of my name. Let's see what this does. Oh, there you go. We got the name. Lucky. But if you look at the function, it doesn't say this should only be person. It would be fair if we pass anything with a name to it. That's how we can do this. We got hacks. How do you feel? So this is weird. We got it, man. But it doesn't make any sense, right? Here, let me try to rationalize a little. This is relative, it's contextual. And if there's no context, it cannot mean anything. Now, what does that mean? It is very much like in real life. If I just say out of the blue, this is good, and you will ask me, what is good? And so it happens, JavaScript is much like real life. This means different things and used in different places. Totally reasonable, although not always easy to use, mind you. So here you go, a different way to do object-oriented programming. You just don't know what this is. If I take this a bit further, there was a wise man once said about object-oriented programming, and this, he said, this, it's just a hidden first parameter to a method. And I think JavaScript takes this quite seriously, and maybe a bit too far. You'll see in Golang or C# as an example, there are similar ways to add a method to a type. So top left, that's Golang. Top right, that's C#. Extension methods, you would realize. If you look at the top bottom one, it's not very similar, is it? However, if you look at the bottom right one, which is in TypeScript, you'll see the similarity, won't you, especially to the C# version. Making more sense there, hopefully. So this dynamic binding allows us to do things that are not really possible in most other languages. However, with that said, there are still people who cannot deal with this, pun intended. Is it good or bad? I don't know. But it certainly makes interesting party talk, doesn't it? Okay, more party talk. Very popular topic these days. As a front-end developer, if you don't casually blurt out currying on an hourly basis, you cannot be considered cool. Currying and partial applications, this is how you would do it in most programming languages, as on the screen, by nesting functions within functions, each with one parameter only. The problem with this, though, is there's so much code to write. But we were told currying and partial application that go hand in hand. The question is, can I get partial application without currying? Well, it's not impossible. There you go. That's what we saw previously. Good old way of currying. We'll see how they run. But at the bottom, there's a strange thing that uses bind on plus. And give it null, remember, would be this and 1. And we don't, because this is not used here, we don't need a context. after we bind it, we should also be able to run it. Now, let me type that in and see if it works. Gives us the same result. How do you feel about that? So, see, we get partial application for free. Quite different, isn't it? So next time you find yourself handcrafting carried functions, think about binding JavaScript. Oh, this is my favorite topic about JavaScript. Now, here's a flow for a client application with a feature that can't be simpler. It gets a member profile from the server, deserializes it to a member object, so the client-side code can understand and manipulate it. The client application then updates the address to a beautiful UI, I'm quite sure. Then it serializes it and puts it back to the server. Pretty reasonable, right? Until one day, somebody wants to add a new field called mobile to the member profile. But the client side is yet to be updated, right? There's always a lag. It doesn't know the existence of this new field. And you won't like what's going to happen next. Well, through deserialization and serialization, by the time the put request arrives at the server, the mobile field is lost. Have you come across this before? You have to, use different workarounds, all sorts of hacks, such as using patch for put or overloading null values with all sorts of meanings. This is quite a big problem, in my opinion, how we currently do serialization and deserialization. Let me explain a bit more. So this is what I consider an ideal pair of deserialized and serialized functions. The gist is, if we serialize an object into a string, then deserialize it, we should get the exact same object back. Reasonable? Conversely, if we deserialize a string to an object and then serialize it, we should get the exact same string back, shouldn't we? Well, sounds reasonable. In fact, is a lot of so-called lossless serializers out there that can't really satisfy this seemingly simple criteria. Now, if this is not satisfied, we've seen, we will never be able to add a new mobile field to our beautiful application without breaking the user experience, at least for a period of time. Good news is, this is never a problem with JavaScript. Well, because JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So if we are using JSON and use JavaScript for both front-end and back-end, no serialization or deserialization is ever needed. Our application just happily takes a JSON, does its thing, gives us a JSON back. No fuss, no hassle. Tell you what, I personally know people or organizations choose JavaScript just for this reason. If we go back to the previous notation, as far as JSON is concerned, JavaScript has lossless serialization and deserialization because JavaScript uses this identity function, which takes anything and just gives it back as it is. Now, is this cheating? Well, maybe. Is it convenient? Most certainly. So next time you get fed up with serialization and deserialization, think about JavaScript. Okay, that's enough JavaScript. Let's go to React. Well, in fact, React is a JavaScript library. Remember, they insist it's a library, not a framework. It's important if you want to speak as a front-end developer, if that matters. For one of my very first React tasks, I opened the code and stared in complete disbelief at something like this on the screen. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. This is wrong on so many levels. Yuck. Now, first of all, where is the view or template? And why is there HTML in my controller? It took me quite a while to get over this initial shock until a big realization came over me. And by looking back at my days with views and templates, the templating problem, you see, we start using templates with something that it's neat and tidy with HTML text only, just data, no code inside. Perfect. Yay. However, one day we decided, wouldn't our lives be much easier if we can dynamically generate list item text from a collection of objects, right? So we introduced a special syntax for loops, then if-else statements, then switch cases. And then before you have a chance to reconsider, there's a new language to learn. If we're lucky, it might look like the same language that we use, but sometimes it's not. Even if it is, it would have various quirks and gotchas. It's a trap! It's a trap! Now, with that in mind, if we look back at this, it's not that bad. I'll tell you something, these HTML tags, they're actually JavaScript functions in disguise. So div is actually a function, button is a function. And they play really nicely with the rest of our code. No extra templating language to learn. What a relief, right? Now, what's also important here is the HTML template becomes first class, which means it's malleable and it's up to any sort of manipulation we can do with any other code, values, variables. All in all, it turns out to be a pretty smart decision. And remember what I said about CSS being ugly and unpredictable? Well, to make it even more weird, there are people who put CSS in JavaScript now. Hence, CSS in JS. Relish that thought. Never mind the angry face. It's actually really, really cool, CSS and JS. It makes CSS much more predictable. So we'll let that go, but there's something else that really nags me. There are nothing but naked functions everywhere. No classes, no namespaces. It's madness. Dude, where's my class? I mean, it was back in 2019. I understand we were much less civilized back then, right? But still, we were not savages, and this was the most popular front-end framework library there is. So I took to the internet and found code snippets like this, and I thought, phew. Well, at least some people had good sense eventually. It's a bit late, but you know, better than never. I could forgive and forget. I'm a nice guy. And then I found out this was actually the old way of writing React. What a blow. And not for the first time in my life, I missed out on the golden age. That's our joke. Of course, slowly I got used to functions, and I must say I really loved it. Since I got used to it, I don't really miss the classes. With React, or the new functional React, you don't even have to look. Functions are everywhere. In new code bases, you just don't find classes. It's very, very rare to find classes. Now, I really want to understand the reasoning behind this really ballsy and backward decision, right? And I found the introduction to hooks. Oh my God, the bad things they can say about JavaScript, which we can all agree, but also on classes, which a lot of us would be offended. Imagine the poop storm, right? What's amazing, they pushed it through, so now we're all dealing with nothing but functions in React, at least the new React. As it stands, if not single-handedly, I think React had a big role to play in switching the web front-end trend from mostly object-oriented to functional programming. This is quite exceptional in my opinion. Think about it. There have been functional programmers crying our hearts out, trying to get more adoption. But at the end, it's the JavaScript people who did it. Who would have thought? So, the moral is, if you want a taste of functional programming, just write some React. Ironically, because how well they made this move, I personally knew people who write functional React for a living without being aware now they may be considered by others as functional programmers. You tell them they're functional, they'd be like, what? I'm functional? Well, you're certainly not an object-oriented programmer anymore, right? They won't be happy seeing your face at their party. Use functions every day. Come on, you've got to pick a side, dudes. Just so you know, React hooks seems to have drawn inspirations from more traditional functional languages, such as this thing called algebraic effects from OCaml. So React really goes very, very deep. So next time you want to nerd out, read some React proposals. A quiz came up. What is the biggest difference between coding for an HTTP server and a browser application? Okay, I'll go to the revelation. State, in my opinion, of course. Now, HTTP is supposed to be stateless. The client side will keep states throughout a session. This has deep implications that we won't go into today. But let's think this interesting thought. If I were to be matchmaking classes and functions on one side to HTTP server and web client on the other, state would be my main consideration. Now, class seems pretty good at holding state, and functions are really good at being stateless. On the other side, HTTP is supposed to be stateless, and web client side, of course, it's stateful. Well, it's too obvious, isn't it? You know where the arrows are going. Is matchmaking? Well, not really. It would seem people are not really thinking straight when such decisions are made, if they're made at all. Software is weird. Okay, we mentioned state. How can we manage state? A naive design would look like this. We have a centralized state, which is ever so popular these days. The state would flow into components. The components receive user input and triggers event handlers or API calls, which in turn would result in state being updated. An updated state would trigger components to be notified, and the components could update themselves. Plain and simple. There's just one problem with this model. There's only one state object, and it's being updated in place. So it would be really hard to find out when and where the state has changed. So this may sound oversimplified, but tell you what, at one point of time, quite a few front-end frameworks or libraries had a major struggle with detecting state changes. And there were some pretty ugly workarounds, which is not the case with React. Now, typical React applications manage state in this interesting model. I should note this might not have originated from the React world. Inspiration could have come from other places. Have you heard of a theory that says time is immutable? It's mind-boggling stuff, but I think people sort of took that seriously and took that into front-end programming. And we consider state immutable. If we do that, a new model arises. And it can be quite liberating, mind you. And this is how it works. Every time we want to update the state, instead of creating a new state, instead of updating a field in place, we just create a new state, a brand new one, okay? And this new state will result in new components being created. And we only care about the newest ones. We don't care about the old ones. But what about the old ones? The old states and old components? Well, we don't care. We just chuck them away and let the browser garbage collect them. So this is my interpretation of how status management with React and a lot of front-end libraries and frameworks, I dare say. It's quite the quantum leap in state management. It's a bit crazy, isn't it? Just chuck old states away. There's yet another subtle aspect to this. There's a thing called Redux Sagas. It kind of leads us towards putting all side effecting operations, or more specifically API calls, into a special place that is called, use your imagination, sagas, which are just a special form of functions, really. Now, one consequence of doing this is now the rest of the application does not have to deal with the side effects. They just deal with, you guessed it, data. I take data and output data. And that simple thing really enables us to push for something called purity, which just means free of side effects. And it turns out purity is really, really a nice character to have for any code, not just front end. Another consequence of this design is now we can swap out any side effects for another set of side effects easily because they're in one place. This can be utilized for integration testing to mock out API calls. And I must tell you, it is a game changer. So next time you find yourself struggling with managing states, side effects, or integration testing, think about React. Unit testing. When I was doing backend, I really love interfaces and mocking, I tell you. I can't imagine writing a unit test without mocking. Now, because frontend is so functional, I was quite lost for a while. I wouldn't know how to start writing unit tests without mocking. But soon I found out, because we use functions, and functions are stateless, most hopefully, or even pure, the only thing I have to worry about is output based on input. So most of my tests become something like this. I kid you not, 95% of my tests, there's just 2 lines of code. The focus, of course, is above. It's how to make smart test cases. And now I can try really hard to break my code by giving as many test cases as possible. It's easier and definitely more fun. I tell you, I don't miss mocking at all. Now, if you keep writing unit tests like this, one day you'll realize, oh, this is quite manual and tedious, really. Could there be a better way to do this? Well, yes, indeed. There is a thing called fast check, which helps us do something called property-based testing. It just generates test data for us in a very smart, sometimes even evil way to try to break our code. Really cool. You should totally check it out. Now, to be fair, property-based testing is not really just a front-end thing. It's with most mainstream languages. But again, I came to learn it from the front end. So next time you find yourself really hate mocking, think about functions and fast check. You have to move very quickly. This famous testing pyramid. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but I want you to notice how unit test is with a cent sign, and on the top, end-to-end test is with $3. Well, it just means if something is too expensive, we shouldn't do too much of it. I'm sorry to break this to you, but software is not too much different than shopping. Now, the problem with this is that unit testing is great, it's cheap, but it doesn't really give me quite the confidence that I need, that I would get from integrated tests, that my software works as a whole. What if I really need more confidence with more integrated tests? Well, the problem with end-to-end testing is that they need to talk to the browser. And because the browser lives in a separate process, even when it's headless, there's a lot of inter-process communication that is really expensive to create, to run, and to maintain. Now, for a long time, tell you, there was no alternatives. What are we stuck? Well, not really. Here's an idea. What if we have an in-process browser? Well, first of all, it'd be much faster because all communication would be in process now. Well, secondly, the browser becomes first class, something that I can manipulate the same way I manipulate my code. Remember the magic word, first class. First class, like a code, not really. So these admirable people made this library called JSDOM. It did exactly that. It's a browser that you can call as a function. It is, you guessed it, first class. So this is an example of tests you can write. So this React testing library, which utilizes JSDOM. And you can see these tests use user events as if there's a screen. But in fact, the browser is just a JavaScript function that you can call. And it does all the rendering and all the feedback for you in process. Truly amazing stuff. What follows is this diamond thing. Integration test becomes much cheaper. It becomes a cent as well. So what do? If we go be shopping, it's a good thing. Well, we have to write more of them. It would be silly not to, right? So next time you feel pain about writing end-to-end tests, think about JSDOM and testing library. Now, some of you might have noticed, what is that static pedestal at the bottom that is holding the diamond? What is that about? Okay, to a certain extent, you might have expected this. Very much this means one thing to me, TypeScript. Has anybody told you that TypeScript is just like C# plus JavaScript or Java plus JavaScript? Well, I was kind of told, and I was quite happy with that understanding for quite some time, until one day I bumped into something slightly disturbing. What is with this return type thing? Apparently it's valid code because there's no squiggly lines there. But is it a type? If it's a type, it's got type of make person, which is a function in there. How is that allowed? Certainly you can't do this in C# or Java, I'm quite sure, even in C#9. Strange things, right? And look at this piece of code. This is liberal use of magic strings, right? Surely we should convert them to consts. Bad code, bad code. However, it turned out that I cannot even touch these values. I'll show you why. You think if there are strings, surely I can change it to another string. Oh no. TypeScript doesn't like it. What does it say? Well, this type should be just one of these values. Apparently, this is not allowed. Now, before I explain more, I want you to look at this. Okay? Only Friday is nice. But if you look at this weekday type thing, is that a type? Or is it a bunch of values? well, it's hard to make sense of it, right? Well, it turns out it's kind of both. It's both type and values. And once we use that as to restrict the type of weekday, the only values we can pass into this is nice function. Well, certainly not Saturday. Why? Because Saturday is not allowed here. So we have to pass these values. And this is called a union type. And the way you use string literals as type is called literal type. Quite new, right? So back here, it's a bit more than that. The action type is a union of many, many actions, and each would have a type field. And TypeScript is smart enough to guess, okay, this type field must be of these values only. That's why we can't simply put in any other value. Now, if I were being a good developer and try to make these consts, I would lose all the type safety and auto-completion. I could have done a terrible thing. So I'm sure glad that I didn't do that. So this is just how the actions are built. And you can see it's a bit more complex than Monday to Friday. We'll see another classic example, your payment types. Now in C# or Java or object-oriented language, you think you have a base class or interface, but then if you look at buy cash, it doesn't have any field. Well, because cash is cash, you just keep people money, right? Don't need a bank expiry. Well, in TypeScript, it's done a bit differently. We kind of just write out these types as they are, except with a type field. And we union them into one type. And guess what? When we use them, sure, again, TypeScript guessed what this type field must be of these three values. But here, it also guessed, well, since the type field is check, this payment type must be the by check payment type. So you can only have bank or type, you can't have expiry. Union types. Great, isn't it? And if I try to pass in another type, no, not allowed. So next time you run into awkward solutions with base classes or tag interfaces, think about TypeScript. Well, another thing with this trick of the union types is that you don't have to write tests to validate the input. Because, as we've seen, if you put in the wrong type for payment, it will be rejected by the compiler. Less code to write. Well, have you come across type fatigue? They have a nicely designed complex domain type that everyone's happy with, but one day you have to make a slight adjustment to it. For example, this person type. I want to make a formatted person type that turns every field, including nested ones, into strings. It's formatted, right? Now in C#, how do I do that? Well, I kind of want to reuse the person type, so I will need to make a generic person type that allows birthday to be either a date or a string. But then what about many other fields of different types? It would be a very ugly, very annoying person type. Well, it seems the only option we have is to duplicate a lot of code and just write out the types again. Well, is that the only option we have? Well, not necessarily. If we look at this replace type, it has tons of ternary operators, but what it does is it allows you to replace a type, T from, to T2, within this T type. You can't do this in C#, can you? Actually, a lot of other languages wouldn't allow you to do this. So we have a person we've seen, the formatted person, we want to turn everything into strings. But this is not necessary. Why? Because we can use this replace type. And look, everything's turned into a string. Magical. Don't you love it? So, TypeScript writes types for us as well. Sure, it tries really hard to please us, doesn't it? So, next time you find yourself with a bit of type fatigue, think about TypeScript. What's the catch with TypeScript? It can't all be roses, red carpet, or champagne, right? It's got to be a catch. Well, there is a few. And this is one of them. It's beautiful on the inside, ugly on the outside. Well, in a way. This just means there's no type safety guarantee on external data, which means when you receive some data, you think it's in a certain type, but there's no guarantee. So there are alternatives or solutions. One is to use Open API to generate up-to-date SDKs. Another alternative is to use TypeScript schema validator generators to generate validators. Phew, I said that. Cool, what was that? In summary, I think web frontend, it's as complex as anything else, not more so. It's evolving in lightning speed, for better or for worse. It's championing some really cool ideas. Much mocking from me turned into admiration, to be honest. And it's an exciting place to be. Although I have to warn you, once you get used to a lot of front-end goodies, you might get a reverse culture shock when you go back to some back-end technologies. You'd be missing union types, for example. So I would encourage, especially us back-end developers, give it a go. As they say, it's going to add more pathway to your brain. Wow, I admire myself for my timing. But on that note, we're done for the talk. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you found something interesting from this. Let me see if there's any questions. Not that I have any time. No, that's perfect. But thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. That's me.